Let's give a round of applause to the inventor of the Apple computer and co-founder of Apple Computer Incorporated, Mr. Steve Wozniak.
It's really quite an honor for me to be invited frequently to clubs around the country, and so I usually always say, yeah, I'll come out and talk to you, and I'm not really a public speaker or a real professional type person, but it's great to be here in Cleveland for the first time. And Wojnowicz called me up and said, hey, we got a great lake you can swim in. I don't know if I believe that guy, but I understand it's actually pretty shallow. Somebody didn't pay a water bill or something. And I was going through the Neo Apple Bits newsletter last night, and I saw there was calendars of all the dates in the upcoming months and significant computer events, and it reminded me of this calendar I bought back in Silicon Valley, and it had all these dates of when certain computers were designed or big things happened. I opened it up. I quickly flipped it over to my birthday, and there it was, August 11, Bill Budge's birthday. So it's really tough to follow an act like the Macintosh demo, and that was the best presentation that could be done on the Macintosh, just short of $80,000. That's the only way you can do a better one. A lot of the designers that you've pictured, heard about, read their profiles in Byte magazine and whatnot, a lot of them are some of the oldest people from Apple. They're the most incredible designers, programmers, hardware people, engineers, self-taught people at Apple, and their personalities are unexpectedly extremely like the profiles you can read about. They're the most incredibly interesting people in the world, and I hope they can come out here and address you in the near future. Their creative abilities are allowed to flourish by Steve Jobs' approach, seeking excellence in the products he's after. As long as it's his creation, he believes it's excellent. So he's the greatest showman in the world. He's the greatest speaker, presenter. He's the most capable, able, intelligent person you could ever meet in your life. And all I am is just, normal. I go to Denny's even, So pretty much I'm going to start with a talk about how Apple came into the world from nowhere. What led up to this whole thing of personal computers ever happening in the first place? And I'll think way back to school. Myself, I've been sort of the engineer who designed the first Apples. Back in school, I got into science fairs. You get a technical orientation. If you live in Silicon Valley, there was a good chance that a lot of the local parents worked for electronics companies. A lot of the kids got into house-to-house intercom clubs. We were into walkie-talkies, so it's a good community to grow up and happen to have an electronics bend as a hobby, because our parents were mostly engineers. Early in school, I happened to get aimed towards logic design, very, very early ages, and ham radio and whatnot. In high school, you combine being a good math student. It's unusual to go into electronics courses and learn how TV signals work and sync signals and color phases. It's unusual because electronics in high school is generally, at least it was back in the late 60s, considered to be like an auto shop course. If you were a top bright student, you generally didn't take it. But if you combine math and electronics, you've really got the good start towards engineering. So fortunately, I got aimed towards the electronics and the math. Up until that time, pretty much electronics had meant to me, before I really got into computers heavily, pretty much meant extra little pranks I could play around school, as well as fun I could have, with friends on the house-to-house intercoms. And typically the pranks that, if you know electronics, other people around you don't quite know how something could have happened. Even if you just know how to build a little oscillator out of Popular Electronics magazine or at your local store, people don't know where these weird tones are coming from, and the teachers think, well, the TV's on the blitz. They would never suspect that somebody planted a little siren that would last for years with 27 batteries. One of our favorites back in school was, we were in electronics, so we played a lot of pranks in the electronics class, rewiring people's radios so that, the power would be connected to every, they called them filaments on tubes in those days. We would take little hair wires and wrap them around the cord on a projector. And then when a teacher came and plugged the projector in the wall, you can guess the explosion that set them off. And then we built little electronic metronomes that went tick, 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 tick. So we had a lot of electronics led to a lot of pranks that weren't normally accessible. My electronics teacher in school realized that I was getting into too much trouble, pulling too many pranks. I was never getting caught, but they knew I'd done them all. And the dean would sit there and say, "Oh, Wozniak, he's too smart. We can't catch him. But we've got this file of all these pranks we know he did." Some of them I actually did. Well, anyway, electronics teacher decided my senior year to keep me out of trouble. He'd find a local industry, some local company that would just take me in for 1 day a week and get me out of school for that day, especially Friday. So to keep me out of trouble, he got me lined up with, I could get into computers at Sylvania. There were no computers in high schools back then. There was no way to find a manual or a teacher who even knew what a computer was. One time they sent me up during lunch. I could go up and work on a so-called computer, and it was a little thing with some relays and a couple patch wires, and you could hook it up and make it turn lights on, and they thought it was a computer. Well, I went down to Sylvania, and I picked up right away, I picked up this book called The Small Computer Handbook, and it was one of the first little handbook manuals that you could learn binary arithmetic and how computers had registers and instruction sets that would tell this register add it to that one, then do a test if it's negative, branch here, addresses and whatnot. So that was the PDP-8 handbook from Digital Equipment Corporation. And back then, of course, mini computers were too expensive to afford. And also I got to write my first programs, and that was very unusual to be in high school and be writing software back in those days. Well, I was totally self-taught for this start into computers. And after getting the Small Computer Handbook, I had known digital logic for about 4 years, so I started designing, first of all, a calculator that would just add, subtract, even do square roots. And of course it was, dozens of pages and hundreds of chips. Eventually I started trying to design the computers that were described in the handbooks. And so all on my own, there's no motivation, there's no classes, there's no grades, there's no reward, there's no money. Just started doing my own designs on computer, and I had no friends that I could share it with. It was very unusual not to have teachers or parents or friends that you can even talk about what you're doing. But you work hard, and your designs, every time you'll design a PDP-8, and then you'll design it over, and it gets a little better. A new chip will come out, you'll design it again. So oddly enough, even by the end of high school, back in very early years, 68, every time they came out with a very new MSI integrated circuit chip, boy, I was right onto it. And some of the companies, I was collecting small computer handbooks for all the mini computers that were exploding around 68 through 70. There were maybe about 20 to 30 introduced. Every month there'd be a new one. And I would collect all their manuals and look at their instruction sets and design versions of them. So some of the companies were interested in my designs. I could never talk the local Silicon Valley companies into giving me the components I needed to actually build one. By this point in time, it was my goal in life that this was the one thing that I had pretty unique in the world, nobody else around me, but in my life I was going to own a computer. And this was in 68, in 1970, for example, the very cheapest 4K computer with no input or output. You had to buy a teletype for another $1,000. The very cheapest one cost twice what a car costs, if you want to put it in constant dollar terms. And but still, I swore that someday I'd be able to give up 2 cars and own a computer. And back then there were not very many people. Nowadays it seems computers are trivial things. Eventually, the Nova computer was introduced by Data General, and they sent a first brochure out that had described philosophies of the company towards an elegance of design. Make it very simple, and in the end it can still be better quality and faster and have better performance even than something that was complicated and had tricky little instruction set bits. Well, I looked at its instruction set, and basically it had, for arithmetic instructions, it had one instruction, and each bit had a particular meaning. And it was so obvious how you can just run each bit out of the instruction register into the right chip, and everything will happen with the minimum number of chips. And it turned out that the software you could write with their computer was just as good as you could with the other 16-bit mini computers of the day. But they had a lot of philosophies about why they were going to be so successful because of their marketing and the purity of their design. And a lot of people who were in the know just laughed at them. Oh, they just think they're going to become something big and major. But they made it. Then, pretty much in my lifetime, I'm off to college. And, of course, I got the highest possible entrance exam scores in areas like math and sciences and whatnot. But I really wasn't the sort of person motivated to achieve grades. It was just interesting to be in life and be doing interesting things, and attend classes and take tests was, one of those things you had to do. It was more important to basically pay attention to what was important to you in your life. In other words, I would go down to the Computer Science Center at our college, and I would buy manuals on the CDC computer, and I would study every manual I could, learning new languages and new operating system calls and whatnot. Not because I had a class, not because I could get a grade, not because I had other friends that did it. The reward was totally like solving a puzzle in your head. It was self-rewarding. And I spent pretty much that first year of college designing computers constantly in between the all-night bridge games. And probably went through about 50 computer designs, so I got good skill at it just due to doing it over and over. Also, off in college first year, still I've got electronics knowledge, and there's a lot of pranks you can pull. I went through high school pulling a prank a day. Well, built this TV jammer. A friend's father showed me a little design, and you could hold it in the palm of your hand. Couldn't even be seen. You could turn the knob, and you could jam any channel you wanted. Well, so first of all, I thought, well, this is funny. I showed it to a couple friends. Well, then I went over to another dorm where they didn't know about it. And I took a friend with me, and I would sit in the back late at night, and I would jam the TV a little. It would start to fuzz up. Well, this friend of mine would sit in the front row, and he would just, walk up to the TV and hit it. Perfect. And then, so after doing that for a few times, eventually he would have to hit it harder and harder and harder. And everyone in the room these are totally normal college kids, You'd say they were the peaceful sort, this back in Vietnam days, and, very, very normal, casual, simple people. After a while, they would be throwing chairs at the TV set to fix it. And every night, they would station a guy next to the TV, and it was his job when it went bad to hit it and make it work. That was a lot of fun. Well, so sometimes, and it was interesting, never to get caught. I would even be the one, I would carry the jammer in my left hand. I'd go up and turn the fine tuning on the TV with my right hand, and it would go perfect. And I'd pull my hand away, and it goes bad. You tune it a little, and perfect, bad. It's the most frustrating thing in the world. You can't get this TV set to work yet. It seems so close. And we would take the TV jammer down to local TV stores, and they had quite a few interesting salesmen would really get flustered trying to demonstrate how good this TV was. So anyway, one time, I sent out some Morse code because I knew there was a ham radio operator in the dorm, and everybody said, Morse code, that's that ham radio operator. And boy, they were going to throw his thing out the window. So I was even on the vigilante committee, but he survived. One time they messed up the red, green, and blue controls so badly, and they had to call a repairman in. Well, I came back one night, and I started jamming it, and they said, oh, the repairman said it's the antenna. So one of them held the antenna up in the air. What happens? Anyone know what happens? Perfect. Well, it only stayed perfect for about a minute, and then it went a little bit hazy, so he held it up real high. Okay, and then eventually he had to stand on a chair, and it was perfect. And then within just a couple minutes, he had to stand on his tiptoes, and it was perfect. And if he came down on his heels, it wasn't. And that was fun. Another time, 5 of them are crowded around this TV set. And I noticed, all of a sudden, they're working on it, and I'm leaving it heavily jammed. All of a sudden, I noticed a guy had his hand on the middle of the screen, and his foot was in the air up on a chair. So, perfect. Okay? And I didn't think he would actually notice it, but he discovered that if he pulled his hand away or put his foot down, it went bad. And it's hard to believe, but I hope there's some people going to Ohio State next year or something that are listening. But for a half an hour, 20 normal college kids watched Mission Impossible with a hand on the middle of the screen. But then that wasn't enough. I was taking my first computer course ever, and they were teaching the course partly on TV. A third of the class would see it live, but 2/3 of the class would sit in a big room with 4 TV monitors. So I took the jammer in there, and it was closed circuit on channel 3, so I was able to jam it. Fortunately, the ones that went out the worst were furthest from me. So, I thought this is neat. I built it inside of a magic marker. It was that small, so it was very well disguised. Unfortunately, a thing I didn't count on, 3 TAs up in the front of the class start looking over everybody, trying to spot who's got the transmitter. I freeze. I'm scared. If I make a move and turn this thing off, somebody's going to see me and they're going to know. And I was thinking, so for about the first 10 minutes, I'm thinking, this is hairy. I'm not going to be able to turn this thing off. I'm scared to death. Eventually, one of the TAs walks out of the room, and up on the TV set, the professor gets tapped on the shoulder, and he makes announcements about a transmitter. And boy, there's no way in the world I was going to get caught turning this thing off. Well, it got a little bit easier. By the end of class, they weren't watching that closely, and about a few minutes before class was going to end, the first guy got up to leave, and he was right under the TV set that was screwed up the worst. Yeah, George Forbes told me to watch my language. So, anyway, he gets up and starts walking out of the class early. So, of course, I grabbed my magic marker and I made the TV sets fade in and out as he walked. And as soon as he went out of the room, perfect. And it was very delightful to see a TA point at him. And later I found out they said, there he goes. So I learned a lesson. If you're ever going to do a real good technical prank, make sure it looks like somebody else did it, and you did 2 pranks for the cost of 1. So anyway, so why is a story like this so great to tell? You know, because especially, I don't know, to a technical audience, there's something about humor and fun, and things ought to have kind of an entertaining and a playful value to them, whether it's, you know, and I think that's been a lot of the theme of the Apple computer from day one. So anyway, here I am, first year of college, and I'm really, really serious and working hard. And they had a computer there, and right away I started, of course, reading every manual I could to try to figure out if there was a way I could crash the computer. That was the big thing back in those days. As soon as you got to college, try to crash the computer somehow. So I don't know, that'll always be with us. Started making programs that would start printing good scrap paper, eject a page, good scrap paper, page 2. And other programs that printed other types of wallpaper, you might say. And the university actually got a little bit pissed, so they put me on probation for abuse of computer time. And I'm not even sure if I had a class yet, an official class, so I had to get a lawyer to get the university to keep from kicking me out. By the end of the year, I started programming every type of table I could think of from the mathematical handbooks. Binary numbers, inverse powers of 2, primes, factors of numbers, you know, all these things that are sort of normal that you read in the handbooks. Well, what I would do is I would submit 6 decks with 6 programs, all with punch cards. And they would run through it, and a couple hours later I would get my output back. Each one of them was 60 pages times 6, so I got 360 pages back every couple hours. And I would be at the computer center, and I would get new punch cards back that I would feed in for the next 60 pages on each deck, because that was all that I could run. I could only run a minute program at each time or something. So I would run the next 60 pages through, and I would do this several times a day. And I just had piles and piles of printout accumulating that was slightly worthless. And I did one dumb thing. I ran it all under my own matriculation number. So in the end, the professor called me into his office, and he said, he turned on a tape recorder, and I got really scared. They're taking this thing seriously. He says, this is not what we're doing in our class. And I said, well, it's Fortran. And he said, yeah, but it's not the Fortran we teach. And he was afraid. He kept saying, are you trying to get me? Because the SDS was really big back in those days, and they were after him. And I said, no, I'm just trying to, you know, use the computer for useful things. So they were going to bill me $400 if I went back to that campus. And that's a lot of money in 1968. So the next year I picked a different school. Second year of college, I had a friend who was a computer operator at this local school, and you know, it was an IBM computer. And external protection is always adequate with passwords, we assume. But the internal, anybody who's inside always knows the passwords or can get you access, knows how the whole operation goes. So we would come in late at night. He had a key to the building he'd made a copy of, and we would sneak in, and we would run thousands of punch cards through, doing programs that make flowcharts of other programs and things like that. And this was sort of how we were teaching ourselves computers. Didn't have any classes it was for. And one night, I'm in there maybe it's about 3 in the morning, and all the lights are off, and I'm going over one of the printouts, you know, to figure out what's going on. We would always put a piece of paper in the terminal, the system terminal, the master terminal, so that all the jobs would not be logged. because we didn't want the school to know we were in there at night. Well, anyway, I'm sitting there going over all these manuals, and the director and my friend was out to get a pizza or something, and the director of the computer center walked in. He didn't even know me, and here I am using his computer. So that was a little bit embarrassing. I just said, well, Larry went out for a pizza. Fortunately, it was the one time ever that Larry had told them he was going to stay late to work on something. Went to work for a while for a computer company, took a year off in between college, and worked as a programmer. And about that time, I finally got a local company to give me some parts for one of these computers of my own design, because mini computers were my favorite thing, and I was trying to design them with the fewest chips possible. Finally got the parts from Fairchild and built something called the cream soda computer, because after it was designed, it took a few weeks to design, I would sit up with a friend in his garage, and we would wire it together all night long for several nights, and we would drink cream soda constantly as we did it. So we called it the cream soda computer. And by the time it was done, you could toggle a bunch of switches and put in a binary number for an address, 100111011, switch at a time. You push one button and it goes into an address register. Then you toggle in the data that you want to store at that address, 1101. We didn't even have hexadecimal switches in those days. Then you'd push another button and it would store 1 byte into memory. Then you'd set up another address and another byte. And another address, another byte, and it would take forever to toggle in a little 40-byte program that would multiply some of your switches times some of the other switches and put it in the LEDs. And it was a little bit clumsy, because computers back then it was like mini computers. You got a computer and that's all it had was switches. It didn't have a keyboard input. It did not have video display for output. Video terminals didn't even exist yet. By the time we were done, we started thinking, it's obvious what we really want to do something more powerful is a keyboard for input. And also, having taken electronics, it was obvious that the simplest thing to do is to output codes to make a screen draw characters somehow, like an oscilloscope can draw X, Y axes, X, Y, and Z axes. You can actually draw characters. Started designing a little interface that the computer could control to output to video. And that was to be sort of an important step. We never took the step, but wanting to do it in 1970 meant a lot by the time 1975 came around as to what our first step would be with the Apple. Met Steve Jobs. The friend that I built the cream soda computer with introduced Jobs to me and said, you guys have a couple things in common. You went to the same high school, and you're into electronics, and you're both big pranksters. So that was what we had in common. And sure enough, over that the first few months we met, we tried to do a couple pranks. We painted a big, huge sheet. There was going to be a graduation at the high school. So we painted a big, huge sheet, and it sort of had the Brazilian sign for best wishes. And the idea, we even got a friend's mother to sort of help us do the shading until she realized what it was. And it was very well done. It looked very good. And the idea was this thing will drop off the top of the 2-story building and unfold just as the seniors are marching off from their graduation. wishing them luck. It said best wishes. So, and that one, we had to spend several nights getting a mechanism together. We had to keep changing it. We'd climb up on top of this building all night long, and we finally had a couple of big long tracks and skateboards with bricks on them. Everything's tied with ropes so it can't fall on anyone. We put the tennis shoes to hold the sheet in place so it wouldn't blow away, and we had everything set up and secured by a 40-pound fishing line. And then Steve told one of these other seniors pulling a senior prank one night exactly what we'd done, and they let it off the next morning. So it didn't quite make its show. We came up with a real clever one, though. They were going to have a graduation, and we thought all the parents at our high school would sit out in the stadium on the field, and the kids would be in the stadium stands. And we thought, well, we figured out how the sprinklers worked. They had a master switch and then a switch for different sprinklers. We would turn on the one on the parents while they were sitting out there watching graduation. And we got a little locksmith friend of ours to come help us pick our way into this building where they had all the switches, and we were going to tie fishing line to it and have it ready to pull outside and just pull the thing to turn the sprinklers on. In the meantime, we were going to make sure we epoxied the whole panel shut so they couldn't come and turn it on. And we weren't quite able to pull that one off. We were out late at night, though, and we couldn't quite get into the right building. Anyway, in this summer, I'm about to head back to my third year of college, and I picked up an Esquire magazine at my parents' house and started reading an article entitled Secrets of the Little Blue Box. And it had a picture of something that looked like a calculator, and it said fiction. Okay, well, I started reading this fiction article. I normally don't read them, but it was there, and I didn't have anything to. So I started reading it, and it tells this incredible story about these kids who go out to lonely payphones late at night and start placing calls all over the world, and they call payphones in London railway stations and dial-a-disc in Sydney, Australia. And it was so intriguing. And the hero of this article was a guy named Captain Crunch. And Captain Crunch would sort of sit there half trying to boast about how he knew everything he could do with phones, but that, of course, he didn't do anything illegal anymore because Ma Bell might be tapping his line. And he would be saying, I only, of course, I know all about Ma Bell. Ma Bell has weaknesses, but I only explore a computer. I'm interested in computers, systems. I want to explore them, to go as deep as I can and to discover it. It's a system. And, of course, I don't do those things anymore. Ma Bell, knows I don't do them anymore. He would be one of these dual personality type folks. And he came across the story. He came across so incredibly interesting in the story. And my image was he had this van with racks of telephone equipment. And he would pull up in Arizona. He'd pull up to a payphone. And he'd clamp into the cables and direct networks all over the country. And this was the most incredible engineer you could ever meet. So before I was even done with the article, I called Jobs up on the phone, and I said, listen, let me read you this guy Captain Crunch. And I started reading him the whole article and telling him about these kids and their mysterious little box that could make free calls just by playing the right tones into your telephone. And it was labeled fiction, but I started talking to Steve saying they gave out too much information for a fiction. You don't say 700 and 900 hertz, 700 and 1100 hertz, 127 for the sender, or whatever the numbers were. You don't give that much information in a fiction. Something's wrong. So the next day was Sunday, and we decided to go check it out. Supposedly there were telephone company manuals that had been withdrawn from circulation that had the proper information. Well, we went over to the local technical library that we knew of, and on a Sunday, about the only place we knew that didn't have any security, and we knew there was always open doors and we could get in and read computer magazines and things, was Stanford Linear Accelerator. So we went over there and walked in one of our normal doors and we found just walked to the library. We used it frequently and started looking through books to find out if anything in this Esquire article really might be printed in some phone company documentation. And sure enough, we discovered that everything in the article totally matched some frequencies that were used for long-distance telephone line switching. So we knew that we were onto an article that was labeled fiction but was real. And this sort of set the tone for our exciting life of the next year. We were out to just explore this incredible little device and actually, have this fun and show off at the parties with it. And it related to electronics, so of course I was intrigued. That was my only reason. Okay, heading off to Berkeley, and pretty much, I took the same approach I had first year college, which was, learn what's interesting. I would take computer science courses. I'd flip through the book quickly the first couple of weeks, learn all the interesting, important stuff. I would do problems that I was interested in. I would not necessarily do the problems that were assigned for homework. And for that, sometimes I'd get perfect scores on every test and get a B in the course for not doing the homework. But still, I knew I was doing the right thing. So I started actually building little black boxes and red boxes and eventually a blue box. And these are devices that can place free phone calls. And I would sell little black boxes, $2 worth of electronic components. Put it on your phone. Anyone who calls you wouldn't get billed. And a couple of the kids, their parents would write them letters saying, "How come we never got billed for a call from Florida?" So we were having, fun. I was becoming master comedian, reading all the articles about the interesting characters and the interesting things you can do with these boxes, and how you can just put the right tones onto the phone line, go from country to country, up to the satellite, back down, call the phone next to you, and hear it a half second later. Eventually, this guy Captain Crunch was supposedly heavily wanted by the FBI for all of his mischief, and there was no way to get a hold of him because nobody knew his name. Well, he did a radio station interview in our area, and we tried to get that radio station to get us onto him, and that didn't quite work out. And one day a guy came by my dorm room, and I started telling him all these incredible blue box stories and jokes and pranks, and I told him how my code name in the day was Berkeley Blue, and Jobs was Oaf Tobark. And he said, "Don't tell anybody, but I know who Captain Crunch is." I said, "Who?" He said, "He works in Cupertino at KKUP." So, boy, we got on the phone to KKUP, and we arranged to meet Crunch in a few days. And he came out, and, of course, he showed us all the tricks you can do, how you call every country, talk to the operators, get around, every trick and code you could do on blue boxes, and it was quite an amazing night in our life. And then on the way home, Jobs' car broke down, generator ran out, so we walked off the freeway to a gas station, and we started making a call with the blue box to call somebody to pick us up. You know, because it's pretty late. It's like 1 in the morning. We call back to the dorms, and this is the first time we ever used a blue box on a payphone. Putting the tones on it, and the operator comes back on the line, and we're scared that they're going to catch us, and we finally decided just to put in coins. We can't afford to do a blue box because we don't know how to do this on payphones. Cop car drives up, and we knew that she'd called the cops. Well, Steve is shaking with the blue box, and finally I managed to get it from him, get it in my pocket while the cop was searching in the bushes thinking we threw something in there. And the cop finally searches me, finds the blue box. And he says, well, what is this? I say, well, you push the buttons. Beep, 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 beep. You see, it's an electronic music synthesizer. And this was, and then he said, well, what's the orange button for? You know, that's the one you seize the trunk with. And Steve says, well, that's for calibration. So another cop pulls up, and this cop is holding this little box, beep, 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 beep. We know that they've already been called, told, and they say, what is it? Electronic music synthesizer. So we said the computer plugs in inside of it and everything, and well, we knew we were caught, so they put us in the back of their car, and they're holding onto the blue box in the front, and they're going to drive us out to check out our story about a broken down car. So the cop turns around, hands the blue box back, and says, a guy named Mook beat you to it. So anyway, Steve and I, this was kind of our first little business. We started selling blue boxes door to door in the dorms. And I was happy to make them, and Steve was happy to get some money. And it's hard, people do not believe that we actually did this door to door, but we had clever ways to find out if we had the right people. And then we would arrange for 20 people. Every one of them had to know somebody in another country. They would all show up that evening, and whatever dorm it was in, I would insist that they connect a speaker so everybody can hear everything that goes on. This was like a show. I was master of ceremonies. And I would always insist that they record it, because somehow we had a feeling that this was like one of the most historic, memorable things of their life, and they always had to have a tape recording because it was worth so much. And we'd call all these countries, pulling pranks, reserving hotels in Paris for the president, and waking the Pope up saying we were Henry Kissinger, and it was embarrassing when the bishop, who was going to be the translator, said, "You're not Henry Kissinger," and I said, "Well, I should have used an accent, huh?" So, and we would show up, and we would call country to country. We would call London. We would get them to route our call to Tokyo, back to London to Tokyo, to London to Tokyo, and then we'd call the room next to ours, the dorm room next to it, talk in one phone, hear it in the other room a second later, and of course everybody was amazed to see these incredible demos. Late at night, Steve and I would go out to pay phones, and we would just call country after everything we could with the blue boxes, every code, how to talk to the operators and trick them into putting your call through to somewhere else. And we got pretty good at it. Well, one time we go to 2 pay phones, and we got 1 blue box. We'll both share it. Well, I knew Steve was busy on his calls, so I just had the operator, the local phone agent, we knew the name of George Alex. So I did an emergency interrupt to Steve's pay phone from George Alex. And so all of a sudden he hangs up his phone, and he turns to me and says, "We got to get out of here." And I'm near laughter, and I said, "Nothing to worry about." And he says, No, George Alex is here." And I said, No, Steve, he's not. I figured he would understand what happened. No, George Alex is here. He can get pretty hyper, so it took quite a while. He was running off for the parking lot before I could convince him that. So even he could be pranked out once in a while. Anyway, I did have one important philosophy that I picked up from the Esquire article on blue boxes. Okay, and blue boxes is kind of like you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. You're using somebody else's system you shouldn't be using. It's kind of like computer hacking. I had this philosophy that the phone freaks were so pure. All they wanted to do was explore the phone system as a computer that had faults and bugs and little tricks you could do and ways to get around that they didn't know about. And you were sort of the unseen guy doing it. But you didn't do it to rip off Ma Bell. So, of course, I paid my own phone bill. I had $40 to $100 phone bills a month as a college student. If I called my aunt, I paid for the call. I only made these fancy calls on the blue box just to try to explore what I could do. And it was a very pure philosophy, and I didn't find out till many later years that phone freaks like Captain Crunch basically didn't even want to pay their phone bill. So, I don't know. Anyway, after that year of college, 3 years down towards a computer science degree, doing well, go to work, first as an electronics technician and 6 months later as an engineer at Hewlett-Packard, working in their calculator division designing calculator chips. So it's a pretty decent job for the best company in our area. And first of all, I looked at the calculator chips and discovered they were little tiny serial, they were digits. They worked in a very strange way, but in the end, there was a little computer in there. It had decision instructions, and it had add instructions, and it had shift instructions and the like. And it was just sort of another intriguing computer. It just didn't have very much in the way of I.O. Pretty much I drifted away. I worked on calculator chip design for so long, drifted away from mini computers for about 3 years, totally out of them. Didn't even know that microcomputers had come or what they were doing or what they looked like. Was very far from them, which was unusual because my whole life had grown up around mini computers. Stopped collecting manuals and that sort of thing, and I started just doing other things. Started a dial-a-joke. When I was a phone freak at Berkeley, I discovered there were lists of all these recordings all over the world you could call that would do intriguing things. So some of my favorites were I'd call this number in Los Angeles, and it was called Happy Ben. A guy would say, "Hello, it's Ben again," and he'd sing "Happy Days Are Here Again," and then he'd hang up. So, and I always used to I'd be at the computer center at Berkeley till late at night, and then I would call the operator and say, "I'd like to place a collect call." And I would tell her, this guy is a little bit strange and impatient, so, just let him finish his thing and he'll talk to you. And they would have no idea it's a recording, but it was always fun to listen to Happy Ben. There were also, at that time, 1971, 1972, there were a lot of joke lines in Los Angeles. You call them and they would tell jokes. And some of them would go on for minutes telling these incredible funny stories about fictitious or real people. Well, I came back. I'm working at Hewlett-Packard. I decided I'm going to start dial-a-joke in the first one in the San Francisco area. So I hooked up bought a little recording machine, and I called up the phone company, and I got a phone line, and it was $40 a month. You had to rent the answering machine from the phone company in those days. So it was $40 a month, 1972, so that's pretty expensive. Anyway, people would call the machine, and every day they'd hear a joke, and it was usually a Polish joke. And I just always felt those are okay because, humor is worth more than, all this problem about people are sensitive and whatnot. And Polish jokes were real big back then, the official Polish joke handbook. Anyway, every morning I would record about a 10-second joke. Then during the day, after a couple of weeks, people just found out about it by word of mouth, and 2,000 calls a day would come into this machine. It was totally booked. There were probably 20,000 being dialed. Well, it turned out that I discovered real quickly that anybody who had a phone number that was one digit different than dial-a-joke got about 50 to 100 wrong numbers a day. Okay, and I think I get a lot of phone calls now. So I would change the phone number. And then I would find somebody else got 50 to 100 wrong numbers a day. Well, I said, I got to have an easy number to dial. So I finally did a little checking. I talked to the phone company. I told them how desperate the situation was. Of course, they knew from the people who were getting all these wrong numbers. And I talked them into giving me an easy-to-dial number, 255-6666, real easy. And then I discovered that one of the biggest companies in our area had a number that was one digit different. They came over and said they were afraid to answer their own phone anymore. So, and it was fun to run dial-a-joke. At one point, there was a Polish-American group that threatened me with lawsuits a couple times, and I was shocked to know that people had bad feelings about this humor. So I finally had to ask them, well, what if I tell Italian jokes? And they said, well, that's fine. So I had to switch, and somebody sued Steve Allen and went to the Supreme Court, and they finally lost. But dial-a-joke was kind of interesting. At one point, this machine getting 2,000 calls a day, it was the most heavy-duty answering machine possible to build, but it would break down once a month. And so, of course, I was glad I rented it from the phone company for $40 a month. They'd come out and they'd fix it for free, and I would always tell them, you got to come after 5 when I get home from work because I don't want you there while I'm not there. And I was very much into anti-phone company propaganda anyway from the Blue Box days. My favorite book was, I'll get to that. Well, anyway, one time the machine broke down, and I called the phone company up, and I said, be sure the guy comes after 5. I came home from work the next day, and there's a note on the door saying, I was here at 3. Why weren't you here? So I called the phone company. Listen, I was here. Get the guy out here after 5 tomorrow. The next day I come home, and there's a note on the door. I was here at 2. So I called the phone company so irate and screaming, that's what you said twice before, and they assured me he'd be out there 5 the next evening. I come home at 5, and he was there at 4. Left a note. So I said, well, okay, that's enough of that one. I screamed as much as I can, so I called back the phone company very politely, said, I'd like the repairman out to fix my phone tomorrow at 5 o'clock, thank you. And I disconnected their bad machine. I hooked up, in those days it was illegal, technically illegal. I hooked up my own answering machine, and I put a little message on it to these 2,000 calls a day that would come in to dial a joke, and the message said, hey, the phone company hasn't fixed the dial-a-joke machine. If you're upset, why don't you dial 611? And at the end of the message, I said, and if your friends are missed their jokes too, have them call too. So that the message call a bunch of times, will get through. And anyway, I went to work that day, and it was a busy day. I came home a little before 5, and I disconnected the machine. I picked up my phone just for the heck of it, and I dialed 611. I said, I have a complaint. And they said, we know, dial a joke. So every other call to telephone repair that day had been for dial a joke. And sure enough, 5 o'clock, the telephone repairman shows up with a supervisor. So I let the supervisor stand out in the rain, and I gave him a copy of I'm sorry that the monopoly you have called is not in service, or something like that, to read. Okay, anyway, working at Hewlett-Packard and calculator chips, I still had, interest in electronics as a hobby. Pong came out. Saw Pong in a bowling alley. So intrigued by this incredible game with a TV set. I knew TV sync signals from high school electronics. I knew digital logic. I figured out that I can build a Pong machine. So I designed myself a Pong game with very few chips, and at that point I discovered proms. The only proms you could get back then, 1973-ish, were 256 by 4 bits. And we had a few around our lab at Hewlett-Packard, so I put in a couple proms that would say, if you missed the ball, it would say something like, oh, shush. Thank you, George. Anyway, I was working at Hewlett-Packard. Steve went into Atari and applied for a job. And he got a job sort of as a technician, and they sort of let him, he just went around and did wild, crazy things. He wasn't an engineer, but he would take a product and he would modify it and change it, or change the ROM to make it turn basketball players into divers, or whatever worked. And he got to know Nolan Bushnell very good, and appreciated the way he ran his business, and was always out trying to do these neat things at Atari. Well, he got a contract from Nolan to do a game called Breakout, the first arcade game of Breakout, and this was before games were done on microprocessors. So he came to me because I had designed games real quick and done a good job. He knew I was a much better engineer, so he had me design it. We had 4 days to design the game and deliver a working breadboard with a schematic to Atari. And the reason it was 4 days was then Steve had to jump on a plane and fly up to Oregon and work on a farm with some friends up there. Because he walked around in those days and he had sandals. He'd gone over to India to bathe with the Ganges River. He was into all the meditation and psychic type things. So he was He was a much different person than he is today, I would say. Anyway, we designed and built Breakout. 4 days and nights is really difficult to hardwire a game when you don't have a computer to program. And by the time we were done, the job was, if it's under 50 chips, Nolan Bushnell was upset that every Atari game was 150 chips or more. And they wanted small games, again, small number of chips. He said, and he'd seen my Pong, and it was very few chips, because I was a good designer. So he said, if it's under 50 chips for Breakout, you get $700 for the two of us. And if it's under 40 chips, you get $1,000. So my first design cut was 42 chips, and that looked like a good start, and we hand-wired it and got it working. It moved up to 45 chips. After working all night long for 4 nights in a row, sleeping a couple hours, going to work at Hewlett-Packard, we both wound up with mononucleosis. And by the time you're done that last day and everything is totally finished and working and it's 45 chips, there's no way in the world you're going to spend 10 minutes trying to get it down to 40 chips for an extra $300. So at least we achieved our goal and got paid. Next, I went over to Captain Crunch's house. By this point in time, he'd been arrested a couple times by the phone company and caught for various thefts of service and put on probation a few times. Well, I went over to his house, and he was working on a terminal down in a garage. He had a teletype, and he would call certain phone numbers and log into the ARPANET, and then he would log on to several computers that had guest accounts, and he would play chess, or he would dump out neat information files and print out things, and it was really intriguing just to watch him. He would call the local computer company and play Wumpus, or some of the games going around back on teletype days. I said, I want to do that. I want to do that desperately. That's what I want a computer for in my life. So I went out. So I had to, but I didn't have any money. I couldn't afford a teletype. I couldn't afford a modem. So I went out and, fortunately, I worked at Hewlett-Packard, and they have a liberal policy. Engineer can have all the parts they want for something of their own design as long as the supervisor approves it. So I got my parts right out of the stock room and managed to build a terminal and eventually a modem. And sure, I could jump onto Call Computer, the little time-sharing service, or I could jump onto the ARPANET and bounce around from computer to computer, doing very simple things, not hurting anything. These accounts were all public, except some computers, of course, you had to have a password, and I didn't have it. Basically, it was a hacker, and never did one thing wrong, so it's a little bit shocking to read in the paper about how horribly vicious these felons are that are logging onto the ARPANET and using all the defense system computers, which is ridiculous. Anyway, we're getting up to 1975, which was a real big year. Byte magazine starts. It's started by Wayne Green, who's the editor of 83 magazine. It's a ham radio magazine. And ham radio hobbyists were the ones sort of tending towards computer circuitry, and especially digital stuff. So he's going to start Byte magazine to focus on computers. And his accountant told him, for tax reasons, put it in your wife's name. So he did, and then they got divorced. So eventually he was going to start a little competitor called Kilobyte, and it means kill byte, 1,000 times better than byte. And Byte found out that he hadn't registered it, so they went out and registered it, and he had to go kilobaud. Anyway, 1975, the first microcomputer kits are coming out, and the first one was the Altair 8800, the first really big popular one. There were just a couple leading up to it. The Altair 8800 based around an Intel 8080 microprocessor, and it was totally a kit. Ham radio operators were used to using soldering irons, soldering transformers, PC boards, putting components in, wires over to the switches, big long buses of wires to connect up. This was normal to, a small segment of our population to do your own kit building. And the Altair 8800, you'd get it built for $600. You had something like a couple K of RAM, and all you had was switches on the front. It looked like a big rectangular mini computer. Switches and lights on the front, and it was all binary. There was no such thing as a keyboard, no video. There were just promises. You could buy a card that would hook up to a teletype for your input-output device. The first microcomputer club started, and the first one in the country, we believe, was the Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley. And the word homebrew gives you a good idea of where the home computer thinking was in those days. It was people who would build it themselves. Little technical fringe elements that had electronics as a hobby, not just as so they could have useful tools in their house. The Homebrew Computer Club first meeting was in a garage in Palo Alto, and there were about 40 of us, and it's raining outside. And all of a sudden, I started discovering that, there were magazines with these Altair computers. I had totally dropped out of computers. I had totally forgotten about them for 3 years. I discovered there were little cheap computers now, and there were all these high school kids running around that knew words like, knew the right words for register names and instruction names on an 8080, and they knew the processor names and microseconds. And I didn't know any of this stuff, so I had to, I was a little bit dumb, but I just pretended like I knew a little, because at least I built a terminal, and that's why I was here. So I discovered that it rekindled my interest in mini computers, which were now microcomputers. I picked up a manual. I looked at the instruction set. I discovered this was the thing I'd come up to love my whole life and wanted to own. A computer with instruction sets that add registers and send them out to I.O. and makes decisions and branches and whatnot. And decided now was the time to start heading towards building my own computer. I was finally going to own it. People in the Homebrew Computer Club would come by when we were first small, like up to 100 members for a while. And they would tell tales of going to this company out in Albuquerque called MITS and seeing this first Altair 8800 computer and saying how they had seen BASIC running on it, a higher level language on this little microcomputer that you could own. They had also seen them working on floppy disks that you could hook a disk drive up to it and actually have an operating system. And these stories were sort of setting an image in my head of how incredible this thing was approaching the position that it could eventually replace the time-sharing service that I had come to love to play computer games on. And maybe I could own one myself someday that would do all that stuff. Well, decided to design a little computer and attach it to this terminal that I'd already designed. That was the proper way to go. And my goal was to have my own computer that I could play games like Wumpus on. I could write programs and whatnot because I wanted to do this my whole life. I looked around. The 8080 microprocessor from Intel was selling for $270 in single lots. Distributors for parts like a new microprocessor are set up to handle companies who have accounts. It's not like when you're an individual. You go down to a surplus store and you give them a couple bucks over the counter and you get some transistors. But it's not like that. When you get up into the newest components, the state-of-the-art components, it's like you've got to sort of understand what it's like to be a company, and there's accounting involved, and they need a lot of information. And it's a little strange way to buy something. $370 was totally unaffordable to me. I discovered that I could buy a 6800 through a special deal that Hewlett-Packard had. I could buy it for $40. So the Motorola 6800 was the one I designed the computer around. Before I got around to building it, a very unique introduction marketing strategy was employed. A company called MOS Technology came out with the 6502 microprocessor. They announced that it had many advantages over the 6800. It had better addressing modes and a couple weaknesses, made up for in certain ways. They didn't mention that they also were missing instructions like decrement accumulator and increment accumulator and things. But it sounded like it was going to be a much better processor, and that the die size had been so small it was going to be real cheap. Their product introduction plan was extremely unusual, and it was sponsored by Chuck Peddle, and it was to sell the thing over the counter at an electronics show called WestCon for $20. Actually, $25 for the 6502 version, 6501 for $20. Well, myself and my friends from Hewlett-Packard, a bunch of us went down, and you bet, for $20 over the counter, and you get a microprocessor, a real computer in your hand. And that was how we got into it, and that particular unique introduction was probably one of the main factors as to why the 6502 popped up in so many of the home computers over time, personal computers. My first goal was, I had watched the Altair computer. They came out with this computer you could buy cheap, and eventually you could you could buy a teletype, and off of a paper tape you would load in about 4K worth of code, and it would run BASIC. I had never programmed in BASIC. I had been Fortran, Algol, and other languages of the day, but BASIC, that was just some simpler language. Fortran was really the professional scientific language. But I had seen this astounding thing that BASIC had caught on as the coming personal computer language. That was the one all the club members wanted. It sold for $500 on paper tape from Microsoft. Okay, so that was pretty expensive when your computer is $600. And what our club did, we had grown to about 500 members by then. Maybe even 10 of them actually owned computers by now. And it was becoming a real big thing. We felt we were onto the biggest revolution ever, the home computer. MITS has come out with BASIC. Well, one of the members borrowed a paper tape from the club where we kept it that had MITS BASIC on it. And he had a high-speed tape duplicator. And he brought back 30 copies and started passing them out. And the rule of the club became, if you borrow the tape, you have to bring back more than you took. And so, of course, Microsoft got very upset, and it was one of the first big manufacturers going after a club, for copying material that you didn't have a right to and all this. It was probably a little bit unexpected in those days. Anyway, one of the guys who was, helping copy all these tapes was Steve Dompier, who's written all the QualaWare stuff for the QualaPad and the Micro Illustrator products. So some of us actually do good things too. This club was kind of interesting because you'd go down there and somebody would step up to the mic and say, well, we'd have two periods. We'd have, first of all, a mapping period where people would raise hands and speak. They would say, I want some parts of a certain type. Somebody else would stand up, I've got some RAMs for sale. Then we would go to a random access period, and you'd find the people who had the things you wanted and you wanted to talk to, and that would last for hours. And you could demonstrate products, or you could demonstrate projects of your own if you wanted to bring them in, like a little terminal. And one guy would get up to the mic and say, well, I've got a bunch of, is there anybody here from Intel? He'd say first. No? Okay, I've got a whole bunch of Intel chips here that I'm going to have a raffle on. So it was, the personalities were pretty much, pretty close to what I see looking around this room, but it was like a lot of, especially younger, long-haired, the technical, the fringe element, because computers were still kits. You had to hand wire a computer. There were some people interested in software, but they weren't going to build a kit yet. So there weren't that many computers around yet. My goal was, I saw that BASIC was the big language, and I just bought the 6502 microprocessor the first day, as far as I knew, that you could get one. So my goal was, I'm going to go out and write the first BASIC. For all the mini computers, I would sit in my linear algebra classes, and I wouldn't be listening to the teacher. I'd be trying to code Fortran compilers for every mini computer I knew of. I could never run an assembler. I never had an assembler. I never had a machine. I couldn't afford it. So all I had done was sort of self-taught myself how you might build compilers. So I decided, I'm going to write the first BASIC for the 6502. And with a goal that great, especially when it's the first one, you're going to move as quick as you can. You're going to get more done in a month than you normally would in 6 months. So I got to work real hard and got the BASIC done by about November 75 after buying the processor in September. A couple months, and I could go down to the local club, and after I got the BASIC written, and I sort of got the core of it done, and I was pretty sure it worked, did a little simulation with an ALGOL program at HP. I thought, well, I don't have a 6502 to run it on. So I had to go build my computer finally, and that became the Apple I. The Apple I was processor, memory, and a video terminal that was totally separate that I'd already designed. Built the Apple I, demonstrated at the club, and a bunch of people got interested. Well, the theme of the club was pretty much give to help others. Go up and explain problems. Meet people that you can help, that you can give them something they need, or tell them how to do a certain type of code. That was the theme of the club, the computer clubs that were springing up around the country. So I would go down, I would hand out schematics to anyone who was interested in how to build video terminals or how to build a 6502 computer real cheap. I would go to their house and help them hand wire it. And that was the theme of, there was no idea that this thing was a product. And eventually, Steve came along. And on the Apple I, the only proms available were 256 by 4 proms. So the only prom that was built into it was 256 bytes. That was enough that when you turned it on, it was good. The idea was it had to have a keyboard and a video display. It was totally different than the style of all the low-cost hobby computers of that day. When it turned on, I wanted to be able to type in hex, a decent language, a decent number scheme, hex. Who needs binary? That was a big step up. I never thought about decimal. Type in hex and put it into memory. I had to tell it where to put code in memory that I could type. I had to be able to examine memory on the screen and see the contents to make sure I put the right hex in there. And I had to be able to run a program at a certain address. And that was all you could do in 256 bytes. Anyway, eventually I demoed BASIC at the club. BASIC had grown to, I'd written it by hand. I couldn't afford an assembler. I couldn't afford a time-sharing system with an assembler. I would sit down and write the mnemonics on the right side of a sheet of paper. Then I would go back and figure out the address for each one, and pretty quickly I came to know which ones were 1-byte instructions, which ones were 2-byte instructions, and which ones were 3-byte instructions. Write in the addresses in hex, and then go in and I'd fill in the opcodes off a little reference card, and after a while I got so good I didn't even need the reference card. I could do it real fast and really amaze people and even do relative branch calculations pretty carefully. This is a pretty difficult way to do something when you're trying to write a BASIC faster than it's ever been written practically and have the first BASIC ever written, and you don't even have a tool like an assembler. Didn't have anything like mass storage. When it finally got done, finally built the Apple I, I would sit down and type 3K of hex digits into the computer for an hour, and then it could run BASIC. There was no cassette interface, there was no mass storage, so when you turn the power off, it's gone. It existed on paper only. And so it was a pretty unusual development for, products that went so far. That was the original Apple II BASIC also. Steve Jobs came along and he said, look, go down to the club, there's a whole bunch of people that want to build this thing, because I'd been going to people's houses to help them hand wire computers. He said, why don't we just make a PC board and we'll sell it to people at the club? And he figured that, it costs us $1,000 to make a bunch of PC boards blank. And we'll put a silk screen on it that labels where all the parts go, because in the electronic hobbyist days, they're going to go down to the surplus stores. They know where to buy a 2K resistor. They know where to buy a 7504. As far as the code that goes in the proms, we'll handle that somehow. He was used to some of the local surplus stores. He said, well, it'll cost us $20 to build each PC board, and we'll sell them for $40. And I did some calculations. I said, well, maybe in our club we can get 10%, like 50 people to buy a board. 50 people might actually buy this thing. And we figured, well, we'll just barely get our money back at the best. And I said, that's not worth it. Got a lot of other things to do. And he said, yeah, we'll lose our money, but for once in our life, we could say we have a company. At least we'll have a company, And I thought, well, yeah, you got to be able to say that once in your life, because otherwise you're just going to be an engineer your whole life. So I said, oh, okay, that was good enough reason. making money was a very poor reason, because didn't really expect to. His motivation was totally to establish a company and something. He had watched the guys at Atari, the top people at Atari, and he wanted to. Nolan Bushnell was his idol. He wanted to build products and sell them. Anyway, Steve came up with the name Apple Computer, and we would both sit there and we'd each pop up a name, and it just wasn't as good. These were the days before a large market was visible. Companies like Hewlett-Packard and TI could not possibly foresee that this was going to really be billions of dollars worth of market or going to be anything they'd be interested in dollar-wise. So there was no professionalism, no professional marketing of a product. Any name that sounded interesting in those days was acceptable. For example, you read in Byte magazine that we couldn't use MacAuthor for the name of the program today. I mean, even Apple can't. But back then, you could pick a name like Kentucky Fried Computers for your store. So we took the name Apple because it was interesting. And on the Apple I computer, we also had gone towards dynamic RAMs by the time we decided to lay out a PC board. And after trying a couple of types, and largely at Steve's direction, we wound up at the 16-pin dynamic RAM, which was going to become the industry standard. It was the first dynamic RAM available, 4K RAM, the first one that was finally inexpensive, and all the other hobby computers were designed by hobbyists who sit down and design something the simplest thing in the world to design. Having to deal with the timing of a dynamic RAM was not in their realm, so they would always design around cheap little static RAMs that weren't going to go anywhere. That was one of the big advantages Apple had over the other low-cost computers initially. We got a friend of Steve's to become a third partner, Ron Wayne. Steve and I would each own 45% of this partnership called Apple, and Ron Wayne would own 10%. And we both trusted him enough that he would resolve any conflicts that we had. And he decided that he'd really rather have a VCR or something, so he sold his 10% back to us for $800. And it was actually a very smart move, in its time. There was the odds of what happening were it was pretty ridiculous. So he was right, but he designed our first logo, which was Newton underneath the apple tree. And some of you may have seen a Byte magazine cover that was inspired by that, which was Newton under the APL tree. I was at work. We got our first PC boards laid out, got the first few made, and I got one delivered at work, and it's probably an ugly PC board. Now I look at it, I think it's so ugly. I can't believe we'd never allow something like that at Apple, but it was the most beautiful PC boards in the world to be able to see so many traces on the board, all running parallel. And I was just ecstatic and showing it to all my engineer friends at Hewlett-Packard. And in the meantime, I also got a legal clearance. HP was not interested. Our lab turned down the idea of doing an $800 computer that spoke BASIC. And all of HP turned it down, so they gave me a legal release. Steve called me up a couple days later at work after we had our first PC board, and he said, we were going to sell blank PC boards at the club. He called up and he said, guess what? I said, what? He said, I got a $50,000 order. Okay. This was unbelievable. Could have never expected this in the world. We knew that home computers were starting to come, and here we only had one store in our area, the Byte Shop in Palo Alto. And the guy who owned the Byte Shop had seen me running BASIC down at the club, so he knew there was BASIC, there was a computer, it actually worked, and that the price was extremely good. So he ordered completely built computers. And what we were going to do was deliver PC boards that at least had all the parts totally in the PC board working. In the end, the dealer or the user had to connect transformers, video monitor, and a keyboard. So it was not like a built computer you pull out of the box complete, but it was the most assembled computer you could buy in those days, low-cost computer. Steve did our first ad. It was called Bite into the Apple or something. We put it in the home computer magazines were just starting up, and they still called it home computers back then. They figured that the personal computer was going to wind up being connected to your oven, your garage door, your thermostats. It was just going to be anything that a ham radio operator would think of controlling in the house, and not just a low-cost computer that could also log onto the source. We went to our first show, which was PC 76 out in Atlantic City, and it was the first time, aside from college, that was the first time I'd ever even been out of the state of California, first time we'd really ever traveled. And it's kind of interesting. In Chicago, we ran into this guy in the airport, comes up to us and gives us flowers and shows us this neat book, and then he asked for a donation, Hare Krishna or something. You know, we turned him down. Steve and I turned him down. So anyway, we went back to our hotel room in Atlantic City, went there and showing off the computer, and we got a friend to come in and help us demonstrate it. And we popped back to the room after he'd come in. Sure enough, there on his bed was the book we'd been offered in the airport in Chicago. He claims he didn't give him any money, though. The official introduction of both the Apple I and eventually the Apple II was actually done at a club, the Homebrew Computer Club. It was me holding it up in the air, telling what features were on the board and how many microseconds and bits and bytes and how many input outputs and whatnot. And that's what we envisioned. That's what we thought the world amounted to back in those days. Originally, the Apple I did not have color, and I started thinking first about some real simple, tricky ways to do color. And I played with a couple techniques, went down to Atari's lab one night, and they worked out. And so I was trying to add color to the Apple I, and I was also trying to figure out ways to optimize the chip count, combine chips. I started looking at it. Here's this video terminal, and here's this computer. And they were sort of just, it was like a terminal connected to a computer. And I thought, this terminal's got a whole bunch of shift register memory, and the computer has a whole bunch of memory. Perhaps they could be combined and save chips. And eventually, by working in that direction, trying to combine things and optimize the timing and get the chips reduced to the minimum possible, wound up designing the Apple II as a different approach to the same problem. Wound up with the Apple II being able to do everything the Apple I did, exactly, but being able to do it much faster, much higher performance. It turns out that the 16-pin dynamic RAMs that we decided to include in the Apple I were becoming the right choice. We were the only low-cost computer company that had gone for dynamic RAMs, and the 16K RAMs were starting to come out. And so we shipped a couple Apple I's with 16K RAMs, and we were the first computer company in the world to ship 16K RAMs in a product. The reason? Well, they were only available in sample quantities at first, but that's all we needed. We worked out of the garage selling Apple I's for about a year. I would moonlight every night from Hewlett-Packard, design things like cassette interfaces, come over and test out the product so we could deliver it to the stores. And Steve would get on the phone. He would get a couple stores he would deal with, and he would arrange sales. He would do the marketing. He would talk to vendors that were supplying parts and whatnot, and he would arrange for the stuff to be manufactured. Originally, when we got that $50,000 order, we thought, this is great. We got a signed order for $50,000 bucks. But how do you go out and build 100 computers when you don't have any money? Okay, so we had a problem, and Steve is very persuasive. We went down to local parts suppliers, and we didn't have any assets. I owed money on a car, and that was the most we had. And we talked them, Steve talked them basically into giving us 30 days net credit on our parts based upon the fact that we had a purchase order for our final product. Well, we got the parts, and we arranged everything so that the parts went right over to where the PC boards had just been made. They got stuffed and wave soldered. They came to our house. We paid Steve's sister $1 a board to pop the chips in. And then I would come over and test them out on the scope. And 10 days later, we shipped the first 50 computers to the local store. Okay? So we were able to turn the whole thing around in 10 days and then go pay off our parts suppliers. And it worked really good because we only had one level of management. Anyway, the Apple II starts developing at the local computer club, and basically it was a matter of taking it down with a couple of high school friends would help me carry my TV sets and set them up, and Steve really wasn't into the club, so we'd go down to the club, and every 2 weeks we would show it off week by week as it developed, and started adding faster text to the screen, adding color, making the color move around, indicating what it could do, programming a game like Breakout and Basic, show it off every 2 weeks, and of course there was no visible market yet. Because today we can't take a product that we're working on at Apple and show it off to the world for all sorts of reasons that we're afraid of competition, etc. Depending, how deeply you believe it. Anyway, the EROMs were starting to come around and be available. And the first large ROMs that were inexpensive were going to be available. So the monitor of the Apple II started growing week by week, up to 512 bytes. It did a little more. Up to 1K, it had some graphics routines for the color. And up to 2K, it had disassemblers and single-step tracers and all sorts of development aids, and unusual monitor for its day. The Basic was finished up, and so we came to the need. It turns out that we started working with some of the local semiconductor companies, and this was going to be the first computer ever delivered, low-cost computer ever delivered with Basic in ROM. That had never been done before. Also, we designed the Apple II to use 16K dynamic memories, and you could put 48K on the main board. You buy this one board in your computer, and it'll take 48K without any extra cards. And typical for the way the other computers were going was you'd buy this big box with a ton of slots. You'd buy a processor card that had a ton of chips on it. You'd buy a card with a ton of chips that gave you 1K of RAM. A card that had a little more chips, and it had 4K of RAM maybe at the most. So it was very unusual to talk about 48K on the motherboard. The I/O bus started to develop, and taking part of the processor's addresses and saying, each one, we're going to divide them up to slot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and actually 8 slots if you count slot 0. And a friend of mine came by and gave some useful suggestions. We'll have some of those addresses control the device. Some of them will go to ROM programs that you can put on the cards you plug in that will tell it how to work. And another bank of 2K will be shareable by everybody. And so the I/O bus took its structure. Next, the hardware is pretty well done and demonstratable, and I thought, well, here's some color demos on the screen, and people are impressed. And I would take it into HP, and the engineers would sit there and say, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life. They would watch the first color demos so easily programmed, and even in BASIC, on a computer, and yet HP's management could never quite go in that direction. They turned down the Apple I proposal originally to do an Apple from our department. Later on, as our division at Hewlett-Packard, the calculator division, started working on their first desktop personal computer, I said, I'm tired of calculator chips. I want to work on computers. That's where I'm going now. And I said I'd take any job on it. It can be CPU. Even though I've done the Apple I computer, I've done all this stuff. I'll do memory. I'll do a tape controller. I'll do a printer. I'll do the CPU. I'll do anything. I don't care. I'll help write the BASIC. And they staffed up about 20 people on the project doing what I'd done single-handedly all myself, and wouldn't let me work on it. So it was very awkward because I had deliberately and specifically asked for a job on that project. And also I tried to get onto a little BASIC machine that we're going to work on in HP Labs, and I didn't have enough education for that project. So I struck out 3 times at HP. Anyway, I thought, I had designed this game Breakout for Atari, the hard arcade game. And I thought, what if I've got a machine now that has all the color squares? I can actually program BASIC in color, not black and white anymore like the first one had been, and they just overlaid some color stuff on the screen. So I thought, well, I can program it maybe even in BASIC. I knew I could do it in assembly language. That was trivial. I had a lot of assembly language demos. So I started adding commands to the BASIC. Plot a point, change the color, draw a line. And eventually I could draw the bricks of Breakout. And then I thought, well, yeah, but you got to have a paddle. So I had to sit down and figure out a way to build some real cheap circuit that could have a bunch of paddles on it to operate, even later on joysticks, because I eventually wanted to do a Space War game. Had to add a speaker for the sounds of Breakout. A lot of the features, especially all the game I/O features of the Apple II computer, came about to implement this one game and to go down to the club and show off a game that's been written in BASIC for the first time ever. Well, I got Breakout done, and I could sit there, and it only took about 4 hours to write the first time. Everything, paddle controlling, ball bouncing. I would sit there and I could put in a command, change the colors of things, put in another command, move the score somewhere else on the screen. I could put in a mode where if you can go into automatic control, and the paddle would go on its own and never lose. And I can never tell you the pranks I played with that mode at the club demos. We would get somebody playing the game, and then I would flip it into that mode without them knowing it. And they would be sitting there turning the paddle and so amazed that the thing had enough randomness, it looked like it was jittering a little. And they would think, God, I can't believe I did it. Anyway, I would take the computer down to the club, and I would show them the game, and I would say, this was written in BASIC. And it was so incredible. I came through such an exhilarating phase to discover that all of these things that took so long to change in hardware, you cannot make quick, simple changes so quickly. All of a sudden, I can do anything in the world and do a lot more than the game. I can print text in between things. I can flash it to different screens. It was so incredible. I knew that this was the start of something really big when you can write a game in BASIC. Anyway, we started thinking about this computer as being the Apple II and being a second product. And I had really developed it just to show off at the club. We sold about 150, maybe under 200 Apple I computers nationwide. We hadn't really sold very much. We didn't have any money from it. And it wasn't like a real big business. It was just sort of neat to know you had done it once in your life. But now we had a computer that we realized the prospects were we could possibly sell thousands because it was the best of all the personal hobby computers going. And the current winner was the Sol computer. It came out in between the Apple I and the Apple II. And by the time we introduced the Apple II, the Sol was actually selling like maybe hundreds or thousands a month around the country. And we knew we had a 10 times better computer with fewer parts. Well, the trouble is, if you're going to build 1,000 computers and really go into business, how do you build 1,000 computers when they cost $250 each? You need $250,000. There's no way around it. So we started seeking venture capital. Eventually, Steve was pursuing this heavily. He ran into Mike Markkula. Mike had been a product marketing manager at Intel Corporation and had had a stock option there from the early days, had made $1 million. So he had retired from the rat race. He was still pretty young. And he would sit down and he would follow technical journals and especially electronics journals, so he kept up with things. Well, this guy is like one of the most ethical, kind of nice people you could ever meet in your life. He's just so pure. He was going to sit down and help us write a business plan to raise venture capital. He was just going to help out of his own time. He started realizing what a great product the Apple II was looking like. It was so fascinating and so complete and perfect compared to the market. And he started realizing that analysts were predicting one of the rare events where a market grows from zero to several $billion in a short time frame, like 5 or 10 years. And he said that sort of event only happens once every 10 years. Well, he said he took the approach that, yeah, we can actually become a $500 million company in 10 years. And he decided he wanted to join us as an equal partner. And originally, he didn't even want equality with us. He just sort of, he's like one of these very fair people. He could have totally taken advantage of us and said, tell you what, for $50,000, I own everything. Well, anyway, he was going to loan us $250,000 to do our product. And he bought in as just a little less than an equal partner. And he gave me an ultimatum. And that was that I had to leave Hewlett-Packard before he would come in and do this. When you work for a company that's good to its employees and you feel that it respects the employees, where they're going to grow to and how they're going to develop with their careers, you feel a company's good to its employees like that, there's almost no way in the world you're going to leave for anything. And I thought about it, and the ultimatum day finally came, and I had to quit HP to do Apple, and my answer was no. And Mike said, fine. So that meeting was over, and I went home, and Steve called up all of our friends, and he was actually in tears, and he got all my relatives and friends to call me. And eventually a friend of mine from Hewlett-Packard, who had designed the I/O bus structure of the Apple II, finally actually talked me into doing Apple. He said, listen, Steve, you can be an engineer and then become a manager and then get rich. Or you can be an engineer and just stay an engineer and get rich. So I thought about it, and what was really bothering me was this idea that I hadn't developed a product to be the start of a company, and therefore, I just didn't feel it wasn't right. The development didn't come out of the fact that there was a company, and I just had to consciously realize that a company was a different, independent thing. You'd start a company to make money and to help manufacture, a good design, but you can still do good design, on your own, things you're interested in, and they're independent. So anyway, we decided, yeah, we're going to go ahead. Our first president, Mike Scott, came in. He came from National, and he was one of these operations-minded guys who can just take over and spot the necessary things to do and get to them pretty quickly and get them run. And in the early days, a phone call would come in at 6 at night, and he'd answer it himself. And he'd usually say, this is the janitor, call tomorrow. And when we didn't have a floppy disk in the first days of the Apple II. All we had was a cassette drive. And Scotty, our president, would sit there and he'd line up 7 of them. 1 would be playing and 6 would be recording. He'd push all the buttons simultaneously, and that was how we copied cassette tapes to deliver with our computer. And Rod Holt was an engineer who designed a nice switching power supply. Steve Jobs' role was, I was interested in designing a nifty computer with a lot of neat little instructions and subroutines and graphics modes and hardware and software. And if I had a bunch of wires on my living room floor, this was the neatest thing in my life that I could ever own. Steve was more along the lines of product thinking. He thought about the Apple II as a big, successful product, something that people would buy like you buy a stereo. You take it out of the box, plug it into the wall, and you start using it within minutes. Okay? And he did not have any computer design ability. He had never programmed, so he really didn't have the background. And he related more to people who were going to buy these things just as an intriguing thing for what it did that didn't really know anything about computers to begin with. And that was the product thinking that he came up with was most helpful. His orientation led us towards the best parts of the day being the dynamic RAMs, the 16-pin ones, the plastic case, the first time ever for a personal computer to be in a plastic case. What else did he lead us into? I'll think of it. Oh, he wanted the size and shape to be important, that it had to be low weight, but to build it, we wanted to build the power supply into it. The trouble is, to build a power supply into a plastic case, it's got to be low weight and low power. So he had a good engineer friend, Rod Holt, at Atari, design a switching power supply that was the first switching power supply for the low-cost hobby computers. Anyway, we started heading towards manufacturing this thing, and we often speak of it as the first personal computer, and you could use those words to describe there was a transition taking place in the low-cost computers with the Apple II. It was the first computer ever to have many features that every personal computer since has had, and that not one computer before had had. It was one of the first to operate like a terminal. Video and keyboard come with the computer. That had never been a given. It was actually a little bit rare before the Apple II. It was the first computer ever with a plastic case. Look at every personal computer since it, though. The first computer ever with BASIC and ROM. Look at all the personal computers since. The first one with color. Standard feature on a low-cost computer. Look at every one since. The first one with high-res graphics on a low-cost computer. Look at every one since. First one with paddles and speaker and game I/O stuff built in. And look at all the personal computers that followed. It sort of set a standard for a size, an appearance, and a look. It was the first one with cassette built-in standard. When you bought it, when you bought the machine, you got all of these things that became identified with personal computers. So it was a major departure for its day, a lot of major differences. And that would apply to the Macintosh today. We introduced the Apple II computer at the first West Coast Computer Fair. And even at that fair, we had time occasionally for pranks. Well, sometimes you go out to dinner and you say, wouldn't it be funny if we made up this fake brochure for a funny product? And you all laugh. And it was a good joke. Well, my mentality is whenever you think of something that's funny and it's a good joke, make it reality. Go out and do it. Realize it. So I got a couple friends together who'd been in on this one. I said, shh, we don't tell anyone else. This is scary because we're going to do it really good. We made up 20,000 brochures for a fake product called the Altair computer. The big computer up till that day had been the Altair, but now the Z80 was out and everybody was using Z words like ZPU and Zapple. And so we were going to come out with this fake product, the Altair, and we wrote up an incredible sounding document that sounded a lot like the manufacturer was going a little crazy, describing it as, a computer without software is like a banjo without strings. So we made up the dumbest words we could think of, and we also copied some of the dumbest ads we could find. We put a little coupon on the back that if you sent in certain brands of computers, you would get certain discounts towards buying this Altair. Because we figured this will be so funny because they'll get 1,000 computers sent to their door. And that was why we decided we can't even let Steve Jobs know we're doing this. Nobody can know. Nobody. And we actually made 20,000 of these things, and we only got a few hundred distributed because they had a rep at the show, and he spotted them pretty quickly and hauled them in and said, these aren't real. And so we started being real tricky, and we'd hide them under pay phones. And I'd go up to some of the tables that had a bunch of brochures on them to lay out my fake brochures. But I started realizing the boxes have been disappearing. Somebody is onto this stunt. So I would put a few, if I had a green pile, I would find a different green brochure, and I'd put a few on top that was some other company's brochure. I went up to one table, and I took this little stack, and I set it down so that people would start grabbing it. Instantly, a guy runs over and looks at the top sheet, and he sees that it's not the phony one. So I think I lucked out. Obviously, if we did something like that today, if I did something like that today, whatever company it was, how big the lawsuits would be and how horrendous a thing. But we could actually pull pranks back then because the market was still small. Where am I? I would go put this in. Anyway, we did introduce it at that fair. Sales started immediately, and we started setting up a good marketing program. Mike Markkula had joined us as marketing manager, and he was working 60 hours a week like all of us back in those days. And we started getting a lot of notoriety as being a new direction in computers, the best performance for the price. It was not a kit. It was completely built. Within the next year or so, a couple other small home computers came about, the Commodore and the Radio Shack TRS-80. Those were the only two that really popped up. Steve was always quite afraid that in 6 months, big companies like TI were going to stomp us out, but these other two showed up. Over time, The Apple II had a lot of features that the Commodore and the original TRS-80 didn't have. It had slots for expandability so that other companies could start making products for the computer. It had high-res graphics, it had color, it had games built in. It turns out a lot of the capability differences are what gave Apple an image as being a class product for the same price range. Also, eventually, we were the only ones who could support enough memory of all those first personal computers, and we kind of won a battle on the starting up of the store chains, the computer stores. About the next big step was, well, our sales were going up through about 1977 and into 1978. We're into 78. We've designed a printer interface, and a couple of serial interfaces are on the way. Mike Markkula had been pretty much the director as to how you put a company together. Steve was going to float around and just learn every level of running a company and being an executive, and he's the finest in the world now. Mike Markkula sort of had the expertise of how you put together a financial operation. He was going to do the marketing also. Well, one of the things, he got one of our high school programmers to write a little game called, a little program called Checkbook. You would store all your checkbook information on cassette tape, because we didn't have floppy disks. You would load your checkbook in, it took a few minutes, and then you could add a check. Type in a check that you had written that day, and then spend 2 more minutes and write it out to cassette tape. This was, our image of how a computer could really help you in your home. The project was so personal to Mike Markkula, since it was really his drive to do home projects. One time we went to an executive staff meeting. There were about 5 of us running the company over the first year, since we'd really started with the Apple II as a real company. You're a real company when you buy chairs, you get telephones. We had our first 2,000 square feet. That was a big step. Well, we went to an executive staff meeting, and Mike Markkula put up a list of about the 20 things that we needed most in our company projects. Top of the list, floppy disk. Well, of course, his big thing, all of his thinking was directed from this one checkbook program that he'd been behind. You had to wait for so many minutes to read your checkbook in. A floppy disk would do it instantaneously. Second on his list was floating point basic. All we had was integer basic. And if you're doing a checkbook program, integer basic isn't exactly what you want. So our high school programmer, Randy Wigington, who actually did MacWrite in later years, he got to work with Microsoft in modifying their BASIC and doing a 6502 version and adapting it to graphics features of the Apple. And, I retired from that meeting. I was thinking floppy disk was at the top, and I didn't really know what I was going to do. I said, okay, I'll look at it. And I had this little idea, so I sat down, and I didn't know anything about floppy disks. I'd never read a book on them. I'd never studied them. I didn't know how you built a controller, what a controller did, what calls it had. Didn't know any of this stuff. So I sat down, I opened up a Shugart manual. Okay, rather than starting up the hierarchical ladder of knowing what an operating system is, I started at the very bottom, the raw hardware, a Shugart drive with no hardware or anything. I started studying what signals you put into it, what signals you'll get out. And after a while, you understand how audio tapes work. You write a varying signal on a tape, and you read it back, and it comes back. Well, I knew enough to design a digital circuit that could put out some digital pulses, and I didn't know how people formatted disks or anything and how they figured out where stuff was. I just knew I could write some stuff out, and I could read it in, and I could come up with a way to detect exactly when I'd read the right stuff. And I came up with a little circuit that was only 5 chips to read and write on the floppy disk, based upon, and would just about do everything I could read in the Shugart manual about their drive. And I thought, well, there's something I don't know about floppy disk controllers, because all the other ones are 30, 50 chips. Okay, this is 1978. And they're all 30. What have I not done? They must have registers to store stuff. There must be something important that I think I can do that I don't really need. Because I didn't know where I was. I was very vague, and I really was naive. So I pulled out a North Star floppy disk schematic, and I looked it over and figured out what everything did. And I went to their software, and I looked at all their routines, and I figured out what they did, and I figured out that, wait a minute, I'm doing all that stuff already. So I knew I was onto something good. Fortunately, I'd not known enough to go out and design a 50-chip interface. And of course, also, I did not design the entire thing initially. I designed enough that I knew I could write bits out and I could read them back. But there was a little thing called synchronization. How do I know when I get 8 bits back where the byte starts and stops? And I didn't, and I knew that there were all these clever little IBM trick codes for doing synchronization, but I wasn't going to build that yet because I didn't want to add a bunch of chips to my circuit. I wanted it real small. I'll figure this out later. And then fortunately, I put it off till I had the whole thing built and working, and then I figured out a way to do it for no chips, a little trick we call self-sync now. And it's similar to how you synchronize data being sent to teletypes on a serial line. You have a stop bit. Basically, it's a stop bit. So the floppy disk came along pretty quickly. From start to finish, from when I'd seen first been proposed at executive staff till it was working, it was reading, writing, stepping from track to track, and we did not have anything like an operating system. We could not say run a program yet. It took 1 week over a Christmas vacation. Randy Wigington came in and helped write a lot of the code that would format the disks the first time through, and I was working on the hardware, and it took 1 week because we were so motivated. We were working through Christmas vacation about 20 hours a day, and occasionally we would take a break and play a game, but we were there. That was Christmas 1970. I figured this out. This is actually Christmas 77, and I was there every day, including Christmas and New Year's. So it was when you're highly motivated in the right way because you're doing something of your own creation, that's when you can't be stopped. Anyway, we also had a secondary motivation, which was we'd never been to a big glamour city like Las Vegas. You see it on TV, neon lights, and all these stories. It's the big place to be. There was a show called Consumer Electronics Show that was going to be in Las Vegas in January, and Apple planned to be there. Even though we were not even $1 million company, we were going to put our computer on a little tabletop and just show it to anybody who came in a little side wing. And Randy and I thought, he was only 16 at the time, but we thought, boy, wouldn't it be neat to go to Las Vegas? So our motivation to get the disc done was a good reason to justify our going. So we got the disc done, and we started writing enough of an operating system that we could just type run Star Trek, and it would play Star Trek and a few other programs. Well, we flew off to Las Vegas as soon as Christmas vacation was over, and we had one night to get this thing working because the show started the next day. We would walk down to the convention center and start working on code and finishing up the last bits of an EROM that we needed to make this thing work the disk drive. Of course, we would occasionally walk out and go down to a casino, and he was only 16, but he learned how to gamble, and he won. Then we'd go back. 6 in the morning, we finally, sector by sector by sector, we put together a disk that we could actually work. Randy was so smart. He said, Steve, we're so tired. We got to back this one up. We got to make a copy before we do anything else wrong. So we started copying it. We had a little mini operating system where we could read one track in, change disks, write it out. So we could do one track at a time, and we copied the entire disk. And then we discovered that we'd accidentally copied onto the good one. But fortunately, we'd saved everything on cassette tape, so we just had to recreate it. And we actually demonstrated it at CES. And anyway, about the next show we went to was the first time Apple was ever at National Computer Conference, NCC. This was before there were any microcomputer shows like Comdex. And NCC was out in Dallas. And of course, Randy and I volunteered because, God, we just loved to travel. Every time we ever traveled, it was the first time we'd ever been in that part of the world. So we went out to Dallas, and learned about how hot it could be. And it was the first time they allowed personal computers or hobby or home computers into NCC, and they all had little tabletops, no finished polished booths. And Mike Marklow would disappear during the day with his wife and go out to see Dallas, and Randy and I would have to be there the whole day showing people the Apple II and its floppy disk or whatever. Well, for fun at night, we came back. I had designed a system once for a little company in Los Angeles whereby they could show movies in the hotel rooms. And if you dial up the movie, you'll get billed. Okay, so I knew how these things worked. Well, I walked into our hotel. It was the first hotel I'd ever been in that had one of these things where you could actually dial. It was not the one I designed, but you could dial a movie, and I knew that this thing sends its room number back down the cable. So I unscrewed the box. I found little dip switches inside. And sure enough, didn't get billed for the movies. And the challenge was not really to save $5. The challenge was just to be able to do something most people can't do, and that's the right mentality. We also had, on our way out, we thought, well, what other little prank can we do? Because we were having so much fun in these days, Apple was just sort of the biggest, greatest fun thing in the world. We spotted a telephone in our hotel. That's a normal touch-tone phone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You punch 2, you get the bell desk. You punch 4, you get room service. So we took this telephone apart and put the buttons back together so it went 1, 2, 3 vertically. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you think about it, if you walked up to a phone, in a hotel, and it says 2 room service, you look for 2, you don't really notice if it's in the right position or not. So we have no idea how many people went through that phone frustrated. The floppy disk that we introduced in 1978, really, that led the way that all personal computers were going to go. We were first again. The other ones were sticking with cassette tapes, and the world started catching on. Our sales just zoomed once we had a floppy disk. We were 4 months backlogged, and we've been pretty much upwards ever since that day, and that's what really made the company. Half a year later, Steve and I could look at each other and realize we had more money than our parents would ever have, and that was a few percent of what we have today. Okay, that's pretty much my topic that I'm going to really cover today, through some of the earliest days of Apple, and try to make it an interesting talk. I've got other topics, but I think I'll let the questions lead into other topics. So I'll open up a question and answer period now.
If anybody has any questions, yeah.
How old was I when we started Apple? I was 25 when I started designing the computers in the club, 27 by the time we were a real company. Steve Jobs was 5 years younger.
Okay. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
What brought me back to Apple again? There's a misperception that I ever left Apple. Apple had gotten to a point over the years, it had started to staff up and become a well-organized company, and I couldn't run off and do the quick individual projects that had been my original thing at Apple. So, it was sort of difficult to get through a day. It was very inefficient. I got every memo in the company across my desk. I had 1 million phone calls. People were grabbing me all day. I couldn't really work on concentrated engineering projects, and I got a small percentage of what I had gotten done before could I ever get done. So I was pretty much ready for a break from Apple. And I couldn't really it's not in my personality to go to anyone and say, I want to take time off, because I'm a starter of this company. I'm too much, a part of it. But then I had a plane crash. And after coming out of amnesia 5 weeks later, it was just a matter of not going back. It wasn't a matter of leaving. So I took a year off and went to go back to school and stretched out to a couple years, did a couple US festivals. That was an idea that popped into my head. And as soon as that one was over, 3 days later, I was back at Apple full-time as an engineer.
You have a question back there?
Yes. Are Apple Ones available, and how much would they cost?
Are Apple Ones available, and how much would they cost? They are not available unless you happen to run into one of the rare people that have them, because there are so few in the world. I have heard of $10,000 to $15,000 being paid for them by people who had a good reason to have them, like Apple or president of certain companies that make Apple software.
Got a question back there?
Next.
Yeah. Do you feel that Apple's headed in the right direction today? It seems, the early Apple was a fun game type machine, a lot of fun for the home, a lot of creativity in the home. Your latest releases seem to be, of course, addressing the business needs, but really I haven't seen that growth in the fun home computer.
Right. How do I feel? Of course, I've been closely associated with the fun home aspects, or even just something as simple as using a simple word processor in your home, but home aspects. My kid likes to play with the QualiPad. And I've been watching that throughout time, and there's been a large focus. Back in 1979, we started staffing up the company to do the Apple III. And the perception that we had from our market research was that 80 to 90% of our market was going to small business, not to the home hobby that we had originally started out to deliver product to. You look at our first ads, and the guy's doing a checkbook in his kitchen. So our perception was that 90% of the market was serious business uses, and they really wanted to run the controller and VisiCalc, and that was just a mistaken direction. We changed our questions a little bit, and our market research came back with different results years later. This year is going to be a big year where we have some huge introductions that go back towards more of a personal side of things. The Macintosh is, for some time, it won't, until the graphics is really used effectively, it won't have a lot of those personal touches. The Apple II line is being heavily supported, and we're always working on new versions of the computer, new products to attach to it, and this is going to be a huge year for that emphasis back to the home market. Also, IBM is strongly dominating the business market this year, and our product in that market, the Apple III, never really did well.
Got a question back here?
Can you give us an idea what the new generation 6502 chip is going to do for the Apple II? Are we going to see an Apple IIe Plus with maybe half a megabyte of RAM?
Okay, the new generation 6502 chip, he's referring to the 816 chip, which is a 6502, but you can put it into special, it'll totally run a program on the Apple as is, but you can put it into special modes whereby the register, the accumulator, can become 16 bits. The index register can become 16 bits. So it can become a 16-bit processor, at least at the software level, with a 24-bit address. The amount of memory you can address is the major capability disadvantage of the Apple II versus the IBM at the moment. For future to ever overtake them, that is the sort of direction the Apple II would have to go. We have different options. We can switch to this chip and say we're not really going to support its 16-bit instruction set. Although maybe perhaps we'll come up with kludges. We could decide to come up with kludges to support 16-bit addresses with our operating system, or 16-bit registers with our operating systems. But that's only a small step forward, even in performance. We can decide to support the 24-bit addressing so that users can write application programs that have much more memory available to work in. We could go and develop languages that operate in a much larger environment. Or we could take an approach to plug in peripheral cards with other processors on them and say that will be the growth path toward using the full amount of memory. Any input to Apple, this is the right time to get it in, because directions are underway, and they may not be what everyone wants. So how the Apple II uses that processor and addresses megabytes of memory in its future growth path, input is highly desirable from users.
I have a question for you, Steve. How do you think the 2E compares with the PC Junior?
How do I think the 2E compares with the PC Junior? Well, that's
I figure you'd have an opinion.
that's an awkward question, because I don't really consider them to be very heavily similar products. The PC Junior I think it's got some huge advantages in the fact that they brought the bus out the side. If it weren't for that, the product would be pretty much of a limited dog. But they brought the bus out the side, and what's going to happen is, I look in my head, there's this huge world of all the companies that started up, the Legend Industries and the Videxes and all the companies that came out with all these incredible boards for the Apple II. And it's a rare time in history that can happen, and that's going to possibly diminish over time. But all of a sudden, every one of them is going to start designing products for the PC Junior, especially any company that's already done a product for the PC that just plugs in this new connector on the side. And so I think there'll be a lot of other companies outside of IBM doing advertising and promoting the PC Junior in forthcoming years. And it will be supported by much larger community than IBM, and that's very good for all the users, and it may be a successful product on that basis. On the other hand, it's received enough poor attention that it could be an Apple III to them. In other words, it could be a good, satisfactory product, but it didn't quite catch the glow and the press and all that Macintosh did. And it wasn't so new and different. I think everybody says their PC's horrible, their keyboard's horrible, and I think they actually made the right decision on their keyboard to have little tiny buttons and overlays.
I'm a teacher, and after having taught graphing in math classes, then went to try to teach graphing in the computer, and noticed that the coordinates are set up differently. Instead of the 00 point being the lower left-hand corner of the first quadrant, it's in the upper left-hand corner. And I was wondering if there was any logic behind changing the graphic system from the coordinate axes.
Yes, at a software level, you can be given coordinates that put 00 down in the lower left-hand corner like mathematics has always done. The Apple pretty much is closer to its hardware organization, which was basically a philosophy of the lowest order bits come out first. And then the lowest order bits come out first, and the lowest order addresses inside the machine, there's hardware signals that corresponded to 0 being at the top instead of at the bottom. And we sort of stuck to that, and we had higher level thinking that came along in later years that 0 should really be at the bottom. Macintosh, for example, and Lisa, the newer computers went that direction. I think a lot of the software packages that exist, there are some that do put 0 at the bottom as how they work, but they're individual applications. The commands we provide in BASIC, plot it from this point to that point. There's no change in the foreseeable future that I've seen or heard of from Apple.
Steve, some of us have been getting over there.
I'll find it.
Some of us have been getting into artificial intelligence, and the more we get into it, the more we realize that to get Lisp or something like that on a machine, you need it seems to be, you need a bigger machine. Is there any work being done on developing, say, an artificial intelligence machine or Apple into something?
Apple's not really close to artificial intelligence type machines or, their applications. We're still at the, we've got the limited hardware we've got. We don't have 100 megabytes of hard disk and 5 megabytes of RAM, which is pretty much the sort of requirement you need for an artificial intelligence Lisp machine. So I don't have much comment beyond that. It's going to be, we're going to go step by step in our growth patterns up and across and down the markets.
Okay,
Next.
What I'd like to do here is we're starting to run late on time. It's getting about 1:45. So what I'd like to do is we have a gift for Steve that I'd like to give him, and then he'll be here to sign autographs and still answer questions. But this way we can speed things up a little bit if we do this now. So let me give this to him, and then feel free to come down, talk with him, and ask all the questions you want. One of the things that I'd like to do is that we try to put this little show together so that virtually nothing could go wrong, and we came pretty close. And the board was terrific. All the guys on the board. We had a lot of teens that were helping. Hertha and Jerry Gentili and their committee did very, very good. We had the committee, John Stipa, Tom Wysocki, Lee Barthelman, Tom Evans, and myself. All of Tom Evans' people, Dave Narazny, Reno Creighton, Solomon Smith, Dave Wheeler, who worked with Ralph Waller, and especially Stan Skozen for letting us, we kept calling him up and asking him for more outrageous things all the time, and Stan was terrific. And Guy Stella, the principal of the school, again was terrific. Joe Strabel and Lisa Rose were two of the people working up there in the booth that are with the school, and they were terrific. They really were, and I really thank them. Everybody should know somebody with a bus, and I know Rick Stauffer, and I am really glad that he came through because it gave us the ability to move people from another lot. Joe Martinez, again, was terrific because he did all the connections with the school, breaking the news about how many people we're going to have and how many cars and all the lots and everything, and he was really terrific on that. And really, thanks, because you really helped it go. The biggest thanks goes, however, to Mr. Wozniak.
There are 3 traffic cones that were out in the parking lot that are missing.
The reason is that, as Tom said, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him.
Do you know where they are? Please return them, or we'll have to buy 3 of them.
And he's brought an awful lot of pleasure into the... Are you the guy that stole those? We were looking for those 3. There were 17, and we have 14 of them in the booth back there right now. Never lets up. See, if he did it or not, he's going to take the credit. Anyway, what do you get for somebody that either has everything or can get everything? And what we try to do is get you something that it's from our heart. It really is, because you have given us. You've given us all a lot of pleasure and a lot of interesting expansion of our horizons, and we appreciate it.
All right, another one.
What it is, this is a piece of glass. It says Woz. It has the Neo Apple Corps logo in it, and it says, "Thanks for being with us." And we mean that not just for today, but for always. Thanks for being with us, because you've made our life a lot better and a lot nicer. feel free to come on up and ask Steve questions. He'll be more than happy to talk with you. How about, sir, giving me your autograph? This is the plan to get you here and get you out.
Okay.
And
what do you want it to say? Who's it to?
me, Bob Caldwell.